The alarms went off before sunrise. At 2:47 in the morning, South Korean air raid sirens screamed across the peninsula. Japanese emergency systems pushed alerts to millions of phones simultaneously. The message was stark. Ballistic missiles had been detected. Take shelter immediately. In Seoul, in Tokyo, in Osaka, people woke from sleep not knowing whether this was a test or the beginning of something they had been dreading their entire lives. By the time the sun came up, the full picture had emerged. North Korea had fired more than 10 ballistic missiles in a single overnight barrage, the largest single-day launch in the history of the Kim regime. One of those missiles crossed the maritime boundary line that separates North and South Korean waters for the first time since the armistice of 1953. Another flew directly over Japanese territory, sending that nation into its most serious civil defense posture in decades. The world exhaled when no warheads detonated, but the exhale was premature, because what Kim Jong-un had just demonstrated was not a tantrum, it was not a negotiating tactic, it was a message, and the message was aimed at every capital on Earth simultaneously. Most news coverage that morning focused on the spectacle, the number of missiles, the footage of launch vehicles disappearing into the dark sky, the soundbites from government spokespeople urging calm, but the spectacle was the distraction. The real story, the one that takes weeks of analysis and a willingness to look past the obvious, is far more unsettling than anything the morning news could fit into a 2-minute segment. This launch was not about getting America's attention. North Korea has America's attention. It has always had America's attention. This launch was about demonstrating something specific, technical, and strategically revolutionary. It was about proving that North Korea has solved one of the hardest problems in modern nuclear warfare. And if the analysts who have spent their careers studying Pyongyang are correct, the solution to that problem changes the security calculus of the entire Indo-Pacific in ways that no number of diplomatic summits can easily walk back. To understand what Kim Jong-un is actually planning, you have to understand the world he was born into, and more importantly, the world that made him the man he is today. North Korea did not develop nuclear weapons in a vacuum. The Kim dynasty, founded by Kim Il-sung, the grandfather who fought the Japanese occupation and then the United Nations forces in the Korean War, built its ideology around a single foundational lesson: the lesson of survival. Kim Il-sung watched what happened to leaders who surrendered their military capabilities under international pressure. He watched what happened to nations that trusted American security guarantees. And he built a state whose entire political structure, economic system, and cultural identity was organized around one overriding purpose: the perpetuation of the Kim family's rule and the survival of the North Korean state against what Pyongyang has always called the existential threat of American imperialism. Kim Jong-il, the father, inherited that ideology and added something to it: the nuclear option. Pursuing nuclear weapons was not a luxury for the Kim regime. It was the conclusion of a ruthless strategic logic. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his weapons program in 2003 under international pressure. He was dead by 2011, dragged from a drain pipe by his own people as NATO aircraft circled overhead. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction when the United States invaded in 2003. He was hanged. The lesson Pyongyang drew from those examples was permanent and unambiguous. Nuclear weapons are the only guarantee that no outside power will ever attempt regime change in North Korea. The program is not a bargaining chip. It is the insurance policy on which the entire regime depends for its existence. Kim Jong-un inherited this logic at age 27 when his father died in December 2011. Western analysts initially hoped, and some predicted, that the young, Swiss-educated Kim might prove more pragmatic, more open to engagement, more willing to trade denuclearization for economic normalization. Those predictions have aged catastrophically. Kim Jong-un has tested more missiles and more nuclear devices than his father and grandfather combined. He has accelerated every dimension of the weapons program. He has purged and executed officials who question the nuclear priority. And he has enshrined the possession of nuclear weapons in the North Korean constitution, making denuclearization not just politically difficult but legally impossible without rewriting the foundational law of the state. This is the man who ordered those missiles into the sky, and this is the strategic framework within which every one of his decisions must be understood. Here is how we got to the night of the missiles. The years leading up to North Korea's most intense launch periods have followed a consistent pattern. When the United States and South Korea conduct joint military exercises, annual drills that Washington and Seoul insist are purely defensive, but that Pyongyang has always characterized as rehearsals for invasion. Kim Jong-un responds with weapons demonstrations designed to signal that North Korea's retaliatory capability is both real and advancing. When international pressure on the sanctions regime increases, Kim responds by demonstrating that no amount of economic pressure will divert him from the weapons program. And when there is a period of diplomatic engagement that goes nowhere, as happened with the Trump-Kim summits of 2018 and 2019, which produced dramatic imagery but no substantive agreement, Kim draws his own conclusions about the reliability of American commitments and accelerates accordingly. The specific barrage we are examining did not appear from nowhere. In the weeks preceding it, the United States and South Korea had conducted some of their most extensive joint air power exercises in years, including flights of American B-52 bombers, the aircraft associated in military symbolism with nuclear delivery, over the Korean Peninsula. South Korea and Japan had announced new frameworks for intelligence sharing and defense coordination. And the Biden administration had made clear through multiple channels that it was prepared to offer North Korea a path to diplomatic engagement without preconditions. Pyongyang responded to all of this with silence and then missiles. The sheer number of launches that night was itself a technical demonstration. Firing one missile tests one system. Firing 10 or more simultaneously tests something categorically different. It tests the command and control infrastructure. It tests the logistics of simultaneous multi-platform operations. It tests the ability to saturate and overwhelm missile defense systems that can only intercept a limited number of incoming threats at the same time. American THAAD batteries in South Korea, the Aegis systems on American destroyers in the region, Japanese PAC-3 batteries, all of these systems have finite intercept capacities. Launch enough missiles simultaneously, and some of them get through. That is the mathematics Kim Jong-un was demonstrating to American defense planners in a single overnight exercise. But the most significant technical development, the one that most analysts have been reluctant to state plainly, was the trajectory and type of the missiles themselves. Among the missiles fired that night, analysis of their flight profiles confirmed the use of systems designed specifically to defeat existing missile defense architecture. North Korea has been developing and testing maneuvering reentry vehicles, warheads that do not follow predictable ballistic arcs, but instead maneuver during the terminal phase of flight, making them exponentially harder to intercept with any existing system. It has been developing solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can be fueled and launched within minutes rather than the hours required for liquid fuel systems, eliminating the window in which satellite surveillance can detect launch preparations and allow for preemptive action. And it has been working on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which add a second strike dimension that transforms North Korea's nuclear posture from a first strike deterrent into a genuine mutual assured destruction architecture. The combination of these three developments, maneuvering warheads, rapid-launch solid-fuel ICBMs, and submarine-launched missiles, represents what defense analysts call a mature nuclear triad. It is the capability structure that the United States, Russia, and China have maintained for decades precisely, because it makes a successful disarming first strike against one's nuclear arsenal virtually impossible. If Kim Jong-un has achieved even an early version of this capability, the strategic logic of the Korean Peninsula has fundamentally changed. North Korea is no longer a nuclear-armed state that might be deterred from using its weapons by the threat of regime destruction. It is a nuclear-armed state that has made regime destruction through preemptive military action effectively impossible. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, unfiltered geopolitical analysis matters to you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The mainstream media will give you the headline. This is where you get the architecture underneath it. The global reaction to the missile barrage was a study in carefully managed alarm. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. American Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield called the launches a brazen violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and demanded immediate action. The Security Council did not act. It could not act because China and Russia, both of whom hold veto power, have consistently blocked any new substantive sanctions against North Korea since 2017. The body that is theoretically the world's premier institution for managing existential security threats was, once again, paralyzed by the geopolitical fault lines that run directly through its permanent membership. Washington's formal response combined condemnation with military signaling. American and South Korean forces conducted their own joint exercise within days, featuring American B-1B bomber flights and naval coordination designed to demonstrate the alliance's retaliatory reach. The message was deliberate. North Korea's launch capability may be growing, but American extended deterrence. The commitment to defend South Korea and Japan, including with nuclear weapons if necessary, remains credible and unchanged. Japan's reaction was the most viscerally urgent. The missile that overflew Japanese territory triggered the most serious public response in Tokyo since North Korean launches over Japan in 2017. Japanese Prime Minister called the launches absolutely unacceptable and announced accelerated reviews of Japan's defense posture, including, for the first time in decades of post-World War II pacifism, serious political discussion about whether Japan should develop a preemptive strike capability against missile launch sites on the Korean Peninsula. That debate, which would have been politically unthinkable in Tokyo a generation ago, is now mainstream in Japanese strategic discourse. It represents a seismic shift in the security architecture of East Asia that goes far beyond the Korean Peninsula itself. South Korea's response was calibrated but pointed. The South Korean military fired its own missiles into the sea as a direct response, matching the North's launch number with a display of precision and readiness. President Yoon Suk-yeol, who came to office with a notably harder line on North Korea than his predecessor, publicly discussed the expansion of American nuclear assets on or near South Korean territory, a conversation that Beijing watches with intense displeasure, because American nuclear positioning close to China's borders is precisely the strategic outcome that Beijing has spent decades trying to prevent. China's public response was the most diplomatically careful and the most revealing. Beijing called for calm and dialogue. It urged all parties to avoid actions that could escalate tension. It pointedly declined to condemn North Korea specifically, instead issuing generic calls for restraint. Chinese state media framed the situation as a product of American provocations through military exercises rather than North Korean aggression through missile launches. This posture is not accidental and not merely rhetorical. China is North Korea's only significant ally, its largest trading partner, and the country without whose acquiescence no serious international pressure on Pyongyang can function. Beijing views North Korean nuclear capability as a strategic buffer against American military power on China's northeastern border. A destabilized or collapsed North Korea that opens the door to a unified American-allied Korea on China's doorstep is, from Beijing's perspective, more dangerous than a nuclear-armed Kim Jong-un. That calculation has not changed, and it means that China will continue to provide North Korea just enough economic and diplomatic oxygen to survive regardless of what the Security Council says. Russia, increasingly aligned with China on Korean Peninsula issues, and deeply invested in a multipolar world order that constrains American influence, similarly declined to join any meaningful condemnation. Moscow's cooperation with Pyongyang has taken on new dimensions since the Ukraine war began, with credible evidence of North Korean artillery ammunition being transferred to Russian forces and the possibility of deeper military technical exchanges in return. The Russia-North Korea relationship, like the Russia-Iran relationship, is another data point in the architecture of authoritarian alignment that Western strategists are only beginning to fully map. Three paths forward from here emerge when you lay out all of the variables carefully and honestly. In the most optimistic scenario, Kim Jong-un's missile demonstrations achieve their intended psychological and political effect, convincing Washington and Seoul that military pressure and sanctions maximalism are not working, and create the conditions for a new diplomatic framework. This framework would not demand denuclearization as a precondition, but would instead focus on arms control, a freeze on testing, limits on production, enhanced verification measures in exchange for partial sanctions relief and security guarantees. This kind of deal is what some veteran Korea analysts have been advocating for years. It is imperfect. It requires accepting North Korea as a nuclear state. But it is the only realistic path to a stable, lower-risk equilibrium on the peninsula. The obstacle is political will on all sides, and at this moment, that political will does not exist in any of the capitals that matter. The most likely scenario is continued strategic competition at elevated intensity. North Korea continues testing, continues developing, continues expanding its nuclear arsenal, which current estimates place at somewhere between 40 and 80 warheads, with projections of over 200 by the end of the decade. The United States, South Korea, and Japan deepen their trilateral defense cooperation, expand missile defense capabilities, and maintain maximum pressure sanctions. China and Russia continue to shield Pyongyang from the most severe consequences. The Korean Peninsula remains the world's most dangerous frozen conflict, with each passing year of North Korean weapons development making a military solution less viable and a negotiated solution more politically difficult. The risk of an accidental or miscalculated escalation grows incrementally. And the world slowly normalizes a nuclear-armed North Korea in the same way it normalized a nuclear-armed Pakistan. The worst-case scenario is the one that nobody in official Washington will say publicly, but that every serious Korea analyst has modeled privately. A crisis, sparked by a South Korean election, an American policy shift, a military accident in the Yellow Sea, a succession crisis inside North Korea, or simply a miscalculation by any of the parties, triggers an escalation sequence that nobody is able to control. North Korea, whose military doctrine has always emphasized preemptive escalation as a survival strategy, launches not a demonstration but a genuine strike. The response and counter-response dynamics of a nuclear-armed Korean peninsula in genuine crisis are not something that any existing deterrence framework has been tested against. The consequences for the 30 million people of Seoul alone, within artillery range of the North Korean border, are a function of geometry and physics that have no diplomatic solution once they begin. This is the tightrope that Asia walks every single day, not because of a failure of imagination, not because the right people are not in the right rooms thinking about it, but because the structural forces at play, Kim's survival logic, China's buffer state calculus, America's alliance commitments, Japan's reawakening strategic ambition, Russia's appetite for disorder, are all pointing in directions that make the danger zone larger with every passing year. Kim Jong-un is not crazy. That is the most dangerous thing about him. He is executing a strategy that, from within his own framework, is completely rational. He watched what happened to leaders who gave up their weapons. He studied what deterrence actually requires. He understood that the world would eventually have to choose between accepting a nuclear North Korea and risking a war that nobody could guarantee would stay conventional. And he has been methodically, patiently, and with extraordinary discipline building the capability that makes the second option less and less rational for anyone contemplating it. The night of 10+ missiles was not a beginning. It was not an ending. It was a progress report, A demonstration that the strategy is working, that the arsenal is growing, that the delivery systems are maturing, that the window for any option other than deterrence and containment is closing if it has not already closed. The world needs to decide what it is going to do about that. Not in 5 years, not after the next election cycle. Now, because the decisions being deferred in Washington and Seoul and Tokyo and Beijing today are decisions that will be made under far worse conditions if they are left much longer. And here is the question I want you to sit with, and I want your honest answer in the comments below. Given everything you now understand about Kim Jong-un's strategy, his capabilities, and the structural paralysis of the international community, do you believe there is any realistic path to a Korean peninsula without North Korean nuclear weapons? Or has that moment already passed? Tell me what you think. Share this with someone who believes the North Korea story is just background noise. Because background noise has a way of becoming the loudest sound in the room at exactly the moment you are least prepared for it. Stay with this channel, because this story is not going quiet, it is getting louder.